On a bitter winter morning that seemed carved from ice itself, fate gathered its pieces in the frozen forest of Mulavia. The air was heavy, silent, and tense, as if the land already knew what was coming. On January 10th, 1475, beneath a pale sky and among snow-covered oaks, 40,000 desperate Christians prepared to face 120,000 of Islam's finest warriors. By every rule of medieval warfare, this should have been a slaughter remembered only for its cruelty. The mist clung tightly to ancient trees, while Ottoman banners darkened the horizon, spreading across the land like a swarm of locusts. The numbers told a cruel story. 3 Muslim soldiers for every Christian defender. Logic allowed no hope. And yet, by sunset, the largest Ottoman army ever gathered for conquest would lie broken in the snow, and the fate of Europe would rest on the mind of one man known as the Wolf Prince. Picture yourself inside the war council chamber of Sukiava Castle. The stone walls feel colder with every report that arrives. Messengers come and go without pause, each carrying news more frightening than the last. Saladin Pasha Beylerbeyi of Romelia has crossed the Danube with a force beyond imagination. 120,000 mounted warriors march under his command, including 30,000 janissaries, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood and undefeated in battle. Their supply train stretches for 15 miles, a moving monument to Ottoman confidence. Behind the soldiers rolls the wealth of an empire, 200 cannons, the same weapons that shattered the walls of Constantinople. This is not an army prepared for negotiation. This is an army prepared to erase nations. Against this nightmare stands Stephen III of Mulavia, the man history would name Stephen the Great. At 42, he was no stranger to war. He had fought more than 30 battles and never once tasted defeat. Still, nothing in his long and violent career had prepared him for this moment. Mulavia could gather only 40,000 men. 16,000 were trained soldiers. The rest were peasants, brave but poorly equipped, armed more with loyalty than skill. The gap between the two armies was not just in numbers. It was the difference between empires and survival. The Ottomans drew strength from 3 continents: Anatolian cavalry who crushed Byzantine resistance, Balkan infantry hardened by endless war, Arab engineers who treated siegecraft like exact science. Their victories told a grim story. Bosnia fell in 1463, Albania collapsed the year before. Hungarian fortresses emptied at the mere sound of Ottoman advance. But what the chronicles rarely say is how alone Mulavia truly was. Poland, a Christian ally in name, had signed secret agreements with the Ottomans. Hungary's King Matthias Corvinus, praised as a crusader, offered only words and delay. The Holy Roman Emperor was distracted by wars in Italy. Even the Pope's call for crusade echoed across a tired Europe that had grown used to retreat. On December 28, 1474, Stephen received Saladin's demand. The terms were familiar and brutal: convert to Islam, accept vassal rule, pay 40,000 gold ducats each year, surrender 2,000 boys for janissary training, refuse, and face total war from an empire stretching from Vienna's gates to the Indian Ocean. Winter itself seemed to favor the invaders. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing rivers solid and turning them into roads. The ground that should have slowed a massive army instead allowed it to move faster. Mulavian scouts reported an impossible sight: 120,000 men moving north like a steel avalanche. Their breath rose in clouds, hanging over the land like signals of approaching doom. As December gave way to January, Stephen faced a choice that would shape history: escape to Poland and save his army, or stand against odds that mocked every rule of war. Reason favored retreat. Courage pointed toward destruction. Yet the Wolf Prince chose a third path, one so daring it would shake an empire and halt Islamic expansion into Christian Europe. Stephen the Great stood in his war chamber at Sukiava Castle, studying maps by candlelight. Each hour brought new reports, each one darker than the last. Saladin Pasha's advance was no longer just a campaign. It was organized devastation. On January 11th, 15,000 Sepahi cavalry crossed the Prut River, burning everything within 30 miles. Behind them came the main army, devouring food, livestock, and shelter that had taken peasants years to build. The land itself was being erased. This was not a raid, it was conquest. Stephen's desperation came from more than numbers. For 18 years, he had turned Mulavia from a weak border state into one of Eastern Europe's most effective fighting forces. Every victory over Polish raiders, Hungarian nobles, and Wallachian rivals came from sharp thinking, not large armies. Now he faced an enemy 3 times his size, armed with weapons he could not match. Logic said resistance was suicide. Feeding 120,000 men required thousands of tons of grain each day, yet the Ottomans managed it with terrifying skill. Their supply system was flawless. Portable forges, field hospitals, and engineering units followed the army, ready to build forts even in frozen soil. While Stephen's men rationed food, the invaders carried enough wealth for a year-long war. Then came the report that changed everything. Saladin was not here for tribute. He carried plans for permanent forts, Islamic law codes, and orders to create an Ottoman province. Mulavia was to disappear, reborn as the Eyalet of Bogdan under direct Turkish rule. By January 5th, even Stephen's best commanders urged retreat. His eldest son, Prince Bogdan Loshnanu, argued for withdrawal into Poland. Military sense agreed, armies could be rebuilt. Dead kingdoms could not, yet Stephen understood what others did not. Mulavia's survival depended on proving that the Ottomans could be stopped. Every Christian power was watching. If Mulavia fell without resistance, fear would spread faster than armies. Submission would follow. In the 5 days between January 5th and 10th, Stephen unleashed a plan so bold it seemed insane. He ordered the land emptied, villages abandoned, granaries burned, wells poisoned, bridges destroyed. Civilians fled north carrying what little they could, leaving behind a silent wasteland. The scorched earth turned the land itself into a weapon. Ottoman scouts reported ghost villages and empty fields where life once thrived. This was not only starvation, it was fear. An army used to feeding itself from conquest now marched through nothingness. On January 9th, as temperatures fell to -15 degrees, Stephen led his men toward the battlefield he had chosen with care. Near Vaslui, ancient forests and hidden marshes waited, offering the only chance to balance hopeless odds. As January 9th dawned with temperatures reaching degrees F, Stephen faced the ultimate test of leadership. His army had reached the carefully chosen battleground near Vaslui, where ancient forests and hidden marshes offered tactical advantages that might compensate for numerical inferiority. Tonight would be their last chance to rest before confronting an empire's wrath with nothing but faith, fury, and the desperate genius of a prince who had never learned to surrender. On January 10th at dawn, Suleiman Pasha surveyed the battlefield with the confidence of a man who had never tasted defeat. From his command position on the ridge above Vaslui, the Ottoman general could see his magnificent army spread across the frozen plain like a steel ocean. 120,000 warriors in perfect formation, their weapons gleaming in the pale winter sunlight. The Janissary Corps, 30,000 strong, formed the center with their white felt caps and deadly discipline. To their left and right, Sepahi cavalry units stretched to the horizon, 40,000 mounted archers whose composite bows had broken every Christian army they'd faced. But here's where legend meets reality. Stephen the Great had spent those critical pre-dawn hours positioning his forces with surgical precision across terrain that appeared open, but concealed deadly advantages. The Mulavian prince understood something that Suleiman's mapmakers had missed. Those innocent-looking forests flanking the battlefield weren't decorative wilderness. They were tactical death traps, dense enough to break cavalry charges and maze-like enough to confuse retreating infantry. The morning's first engagement began at 7:00 a.m. When Ottoman scouts probed Mulavian positions, what they discovered should have terrified any competent commander. Stephen's 16,000 professional soldiers had vanished into the landscape itself. Mulavian crossbowmen crouched behind earthworks that seemed to materialize from frozen ground. Infantry companies hid in forest corridors that allowed rapid movement while remaining invisible to Ottoman observers. This wasn't a traditional army awaiting battle. This was a predator preparing an ambush. Suleiman's reaction revealed the fatal flaw in Ottoman tactical thinking. Accustomed to overwhelming enemies through superior numbers and firepower, the empire's generals had never learned to fight opponents who refused conventional battle. When Mulavian forces melted away before advancing Janissaries, Ottoman commanders interpreted retreat as weakness rather than strategy. By 9:00 a.m., confident Turkish infantry had penetrated 500 YD into what appeared to be abandoned defensive positions. Then everything changed. At precisely 10:00 a.m., As the main Ottoman assault reached maximum extension, Stephen triggered the first phase of his master plan. Mulavian forces that had seemed to flee suddenly emerged from concealed positions, cutting off Ottoman retreat routes. The empire's elite janissaries found themselves advancing into a funnel where their numerical superiority became irrelevant. Forest paths that could accommodate 3 men abreast transformed 30,000 disciplined infantry into confused clusters struggling through unfamiliar terrain. Here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. Stephen wasn't just using terrain as a weapon, he was exploiting cultural blindness. Ottoman military doctrine, perfected across open battlefields from Anatolia to Egypt, assumed that superior numbers could overwhelm any defensive position. Turkish commanders had never encountered an enemy who treated forests as tactical allies rather than obstacles. When Mulavian archers began picking off Janissar officers from tree-mounted positions, Ottoman response protocols simply didn't exist. The psychological impact on Turkish forces was immediate and devastating. Warriors who had conquered Constantinople and dominated Balkan battlefields suddenly faced an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't counter using traditional tactics. By 11:00 a.m., reports reached Suleiman that his advance units were taking casualties without inflicting damage. The legendary Janissary discipline, maintained through decades of victory, began showing its first cracks, but Stephen had only revealed the opening movement of a symphony of destruction. Hidden in those same forests that were devouring Ottoman infantry, 8,000 Mulavian cavalry waited for the signal that would transform tactical advantage into strategic annihilation. The Wolf Prince understood that defeating 120,000 enemies required more than defensive brilliance. It demanded the kind of coordinated assault that would shatter an empire's confidence in a single afternoon. As noon approached, an Ottoman confusion deepened. Stephen prepared to unleash hell itself upon forces that had never imagined defeat was possible. At precisely noon on January 10, 1475, Stephen the Great raised his battle horn and unleashed the most devastating cavalry charge in medieval European history. From 3 separate forest positions, 8,000 Mulavian horsemen erupted simultaneously, their war cries echoing across the frozen battlefield like thunder from hell itself. The sound was indescribable. Thousands of hooves pounding frozen earth, steel clashing against steel. Voices screaming prayers in 3 languages as Christian fury met Islamic confidence in a collision that shook the ground for miles. The Ottoman center, already confused by forest fighting, had no time to reform. Suleiman Pasha watched in horror as his perfectly ordered battle lines disintegrated under coordinated assault from directions his scouts had sworn were impossible. The lead Mulavian wedged 2,000 heavy cavalry led by Stephen himself, struck the Janissary left flank with the force of an avalanche. In the first 30 seconds, 800 elite Turkish infantry simply ceased to exist, crushed under hooves or transfixed by 12T ash woodlances. But this wasn't random violence. This was choreographed destruction. As the main Mulavian charge carved through Ottoman ranks, secondary forces emerged from concealed positions to exploit the gaps. Prince Bogdan Loshnanu led 1,500 cavalry against the Turkish right wing, while Moldavian infantry poured from the forest to prevent Ottoman retreat. Within minutes, Suleiman's 120,000-man army found itself fragmented into isolated pockets, each fighting separate battles against an enemy that seemed to multiply with every engagement. Here's what makes this moment truly extraordinary. The Ottomans weren't just losing, they were being systematically destroyed by forces they couldn't see coming. Mulavian tactics violated every principle of medieval warfare. Instead of one massive charge followed by withdrawal, Stephen had coordinated multiple simultaneous assaults designed to create maximum confusion. Turkish cavalry attempting to respond to the crisis discovered that forest paths they'd ignored were now occupied by Mulavian crossbowmen who picked off officers with surgical precision. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Janissary units that had never retreated found themselves surrounded in terrain that negated their training. Ottoman cavalry, the empire's primary striking force, couldn't maneuver effectively in forest corridors designed for infantry combat. By 12:30 p.m., reports reaching Suleiman described not tactical setbacks, but complete unit annihilation. The 7th Janissary Orda, 500 men who had fought at the siege of Constantinople, was wiped out in 15 minutes of forest fighting. Then everything collapsed at once. At 100 p.m., as Ottoman commanders desperately tried to organize defensive formations, Stephen triggered the final phase of his assault. Hidden reserves, 6,000 fresh infantry who had remained concealed throughout the morning's fighting emerged from positions Ottoman scouts had never detected. The sight of Mulavian banners appearing from seemingly empty ground shattered the last Turkish morale. Elite Supahi cavalry, seeing their infantry support crumbling, began edging backward despite their officers' frantic orders. The rout began with mathematics that defied military logic. Of the 30,000 Janissaries who had advanced that morning, fewer than 8,000 remained combat effective by 200 p.m. Ottoman casualties weren't just heavy, they were catastrophic. Bodies carpeted the forest floor in layers, the fallen creating obstacles for the living. Abandoned weapons littered the ground like iron seeds. Evidence of warriors who had thrown away everything to run faster. Suleiman Pasha, watching his invincible army disintegrate, made a decision that would haunt him forever. At 2:15 p.m., as Mulavian cavalry closed on his command position, the Baylor Bey of Romelia abandoned his golden standard and fled on horseback toward the Danube. The sight of their supreme commander in retreat shattered the last Ottoman resistance. If Suleiman ran, what hope did common soldiers have against an enemy that fought like demons possessed? By 300 p.m., pursuit had become annihilation. Stephen's forces, their blood up, chased fleeing Ottomans through the same forests that had protected Mulavian preparations. The killing was methodical, efficient, terrible. In 6 hours of fighting, the largest Ottoman army ever assembled for European conquest had been reduced to scattered refugees, stumbling through frozen wilderness, leaving behind 45,000 dead and the shattered confidence of an empire that had considered itself invincible. As the winter sun set on January 10, 1475, the frozen battlefield near Vaslui revealed scenes that would haunt chroniclers for centuries. Where Suleiman Pasha's magnificent army had stood that morning, only corpses remained scattered across 3 miles of blood-soaked snow. The numbers defied comprehension. 45,000 Ottoman dead carpeted the forest floor, their bodies creating grotesque bridges across streams that had frozen red with spilled blood. Another 35,000 lay wounded or captured, many of them elite Janissaries who would never again terrorize Christian Europe with their legendary discipline. Stephen the Great, his armor dented and his sword blade chipped from 6 hours of personal combat, surveyed the carnage with emotions that mixed triumph with exhaustion. The Wolf Prince had achieved something military historians still struggle to explain. His 40,000 defenders had destroyed the largest invasion force in Ottoman history while suffering fewer than 3,000 casualties. The mathematics were impossible. Yet the evidence lay frozen in the January twilight, 3 Muslim soldiers dead for every Christian scratch. But here's what made the victory truly staggering. This wasn't just battlefield success. It was economic and military catastrophe for the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman's army had carried wealth sufficient to fund conquest for 2 years. Gold intended to pay 120,000 soldiers, weapons manufactured in the finest armies of Constantinople, horses bred in Anatolia's best stables. All of it now belonged to Mulavia. The immediate material gains included 200 cannons, enough artillery to fortify every Christian fortress from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The psychological impact struck even deeper than material losses. Ottoman military doctrine, refined through decades of victory from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean, had proven worthless against an enemy who understood terrain better than tactics. Mulavian forest warfare had exposed fundamental weaknesses in Turkish strategy. Elite Janissaries trained from childhood to fight in open formations became helpless when separated from their supporting units. Sipahi cavalry, the empire's primary striking force, discovered that composite bows meant nothing when targets remained invisible behind ancient oak trees. Picture the scene as Mulavian soldiers moved through the aftermath, collecting weapons and tending wounded enemies with surprising mercy. Stephen had order and his men to treat captured Ottomans according to Christian principles, a decision that would enhance his reputation across Europe as a warrior who combined tactical brilliance with moral restraint. Turkish prisoners expecting enslavement or execution instead received medical treatment, and eventual ransom negotiations. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about those crucial hours after victory. Stephen understood that defeating 120,000 enemies was meaningless unless the strategic implications reached Constantinople. By sunset, mounted messengers were racing toward every Christian capital in Europe, carrying news that would transform diplomatic calculations from London to Moscow. The Ottoman Empire, seemingly invincible since the fall of Constantinople, had revealed that it could be beaten by forces willing to fight with intelligence rather than desperation. The immediate consequences rippled across the Balkans faster than military dispatches. Hungarian border garrisons, preparing for inevitable Ottoman assault, suddenly found courage to resist Turkish demands. Polish nobles who had secretly negotiated tribute agreements began reconsidering their accommodations with Islamic power. Most importantly, the myth of Ottoman invincibility lay shattered in the frozen forests of Mulavia, buried beneath 45,000 corpses who had believed conquest was their divine destiny. As darkness fell on January 10th, Stephen the Great knelt among his exhausted soldiers and led them in prayer. Tadium Ladurmas echoed across a battlefield where the impossible had become reality. The Wolf Prince had proven that faith, terrain knowledge, and tactical genius could overcome odds that violated every principle of medieval warfare. Tomorrow would bring diplomatic recognition, papal blessings, and European celebration. Tonight belonged to 40,000 men who had saved Christian civilization by refusing to accept that mathematics determined destiny. In 6 hours of fighting, they had changed the course of European history and proven that sometimes, just sometimes, courage counts more than counting. News of the Battle of Vaslui reached Constantinople on January 18th. 8 days after Sulian Pasha's shattered remnants straggled across the Danube with tales that sounded like fever dreams. Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and terror of Christian Europe, received the reports with disbelief that slowly transformed into rage. The empire that had expanded relentlessly for 2 centuries had suffered its most catastrophic defeat at the hands of a principality most Ottoman officials couldn't locate on a map. The psychological shockwave rippled through every level of Turkish society, from palace bureaucrats to frontier raiders who suddenly questioned whether Allah truly favored Islamic conquest. The strategic consequences unfolded with devastating precision across the next decade. Hungarian resistance, previously crumbling under Ottoman pressure, stiffened into effective opposition that delayed Turkish expansion by 20 years. Polish nobles abandoned their secret accommodations with Islamic power, instead forming military alliances that would prove crucial in future conflicts. Most significantly, the myth of Janissary invincibility lay buried in Mulavian forests, encouraging Christian resistance from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Pope Sixtus IV's reaction revealed the victory's broader significance. On February 14, 1475, papal bulls declared Stephen III Athlete of Christ and granted indulgences to any Christian who supported Mulavian defense. This wasn't mere religious theater. Vatican recognition transformed a regional conflict into a crusading cause that attracted military volunteers and financial support from across Catholic Europe. Stephen's tactical genius had achieved something decades of papal diplomacy couldn't: uniting fractured Christian states against Ottoman expansion. But here's what makes the legacy truly extraordinary. Militaries from Sincere to West Point still study Vaslui as the definitive example of terrain warfare overwhelming numerical superiority. Stephen's integration of forest fighting with coordinated cavalry assault became the template for asymmetric warfare that influenced everything from Napoleonic campaigns to modern insurgency tactics. The Wolf Prince had proven that superior numbers mean nothing when facing enemies who understand their environment better than their opponents understand warfare itself. The Ottoman response confirmed the victory's strategic importance. Mehmed II, recognizing that Balkan expansion had reached its limits, redirected imperial resources toward Anatolian consolidation and naval warfare in the Mediterranean. The empire that had seemed destined to conquer Vienna and threaten the Rhine instead spent the next generation rebuilding confidence shattered in 6 hours of forest fighting. Turkish expansion into Europe effectively ended at the gates of Mulavia, buried beneath 45,000 corpses who had believed conquest was inevitable. Stephen the Great continued his impossible reign for another 29 years, winning 47 battles while losing only 2 minor engagements. European courts that had ignored Mulavian appeals for assistance suddenly competed for alliance with the prince who had achieved the unthinkable. When Stephen died in 1504, Ottoman chroniclers recorded the event with relief, noting that the great enemy of Islam had finally succumbed to mortality rather than Turkish steel. Yet the deeper significance transcends military history. Vaslui proved that technological superiority, numerical advantage, and imperial confidence mean nothing when confronting leaders who combine tactical brilliance with absolute commitment to impossible causes. Stephen understood something that modern strategists often forget. Battles aren't won by the largest armies, but by the most determined minds willing to exploit every available advantage. The Battle of Vaslui stands as history's most complete vindication of intelligence over force, preparation over improvisation, local knowledge over imperial arrogance. On January 10, 1475, in the frozen forests of Mulavia, 40,000 desperate Christians faced 120,000 of Islam's finest warriors in what should have been the most one-sided massacre in medieval history. Instead, the Wolf Prince achieved mathematical impossibility through tactical perfection, proving that sometimes, just sometimes, courage and cunning count more than counting. In 6 hours of fighting, Stephen the Great had saved Christian Europe by demonstrating that even empires have limits when they encounter leaders who refuse to accept that defeat is inevitable.